Yo guys, what is up? Max here in Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over my bloodsplosion Whirlwind Barbarian build. Now, this is a build that got a pretty sizable buff in the most recent server slam, and it convinced me to jump back on Barbarian and give it another go, and I absolutely love the Whirlwind playstyle. This build video is a culmination of my time playing Barbarian in the betas, both the first and second one, and the server slam, as well as using a build planner to plan out a full character for launch that I plan on starting using all the legendary aspects, a full skill tree with 58 skill points, and I think this build is going to be fantastic. There's so much synergy, so much damage, and it's looking incredible. I hope you guys enjoy the build video. Let's get right into it. So on screen right now, I've got some of the core synergies of the build, and then after we talk about these, we'll get into the rest of the gear and legendary aspects, and then also the full skill tree with all 58 points spec'd. Now, to start this off, we're going to be using the two-handed sword expertise. When using two-handed swords, 20% of our direct damage that we deal is inflicted as bleed damage over 5 seconds. This is fantastic because it is free bleed damage on any enemy we touch with Whirlwind, and we're going to be dealing 30% increased bleeding damage for 5 seconds after killing an enemy. That is awesome. To pair with that, we're going to be using this legendary aspect. Now, this dropped for me at level 4, meaning you're going to be able to take advantage of this super early, and it reads, direct damage against bleeding enemies has up to a 27% to 30% chance to stun them for 2 seconds. Now, in practice, when I was actually using this, even though it's only a lucky hit chance, Whirlwind can hit multiple times a second, as it's a spinning attack based on your attack speed, and its lucky hit chance is 25%, and I was constantly stunning enemies as I moved through them, and because they're always going to be bleeding every time they get touched, they always have a chance to get stunned. We're going to be pairing that with a really nice damage multiplier. Distant enemies have a 15% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you. You deal 30% to 50% increased damage to stunned enemies. Note that this is going to be on our amulet slot, so it'll have a 50% increase, meaning it could be up to 75% increased damage to stunned enemies. And we're going to be stunning enemies all the time with our Whirlwind. This damage multiplier against stunned enemies is going to work in conjunction with our Skullbreaker's aspect. Stunning a bleeding enemy deals 22 to 40% of their total bleeding amount to them as physical damage. And since we're dealing more damage to stunned enemies, we're getting another multiplier on this damage instance, and we're constantly going to be having these blood explosions on enemies because they're going to be constantly being stunned and bled. And then on top of that, we're going to be using the hamstring passive. Your bleeding affects slow enemies. So we've got slows, we've got stuns, we've got blood explosions, we've got pressure point so that our core skills have a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable on lucky hit. So they'll be vulnerable as well. And we're pairing that with the aspect of the umbral. Restore 4 of your primary resources when you crowd control an enemy. Slow counts as a crowd control, stun counts as a crowd control, and every time we hit an enemy with Whirlwind, we're going to be proccing this and constantly refunding that Whirlwind cost, meaning that we'll be able to use Whirlwind all the time because we won't have to worry about Fury generation. And this is just the start of our Fury generation. We'll have even more later, but this is kind of a overview of the synergies that this build is going to have. And once again, this is just the start. For the rest of the gear, on our first two-handed weapon, we're going to be using each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill up to 120% increased damage. Now, this is being displayed as on a one-handed weapon, so it's not getting doubled. So every point of fury we generate while at maximum fury will give us up to 240% increased damage on our Whirlwind, and this is a snapshotted skill. So if we're losing fury while we're Whirlwinding, it doesn't really matter because as long as we used it when we're at max, we're going to get that 240% increased damage for the duration of our Whirlwind. And remember, our bleed is scaling off of a percentage of our damage that we deal. So the more damage we're dealing, the more bleed we're doing, the more explosion thingies we get to do. Next up, attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your core skill. This is another 50% increased damage for our Whirlwind. Next up, this is probably where we're going to have our Skullbreaker aspect, 22 to 40% of their bleeding amount as physical damage. And lastly, Whirlwind's critical strike chance is increased up to, once again, if this is on a two-handed weapon, up to 80% increased critical strike chance for Whirlwind. So it's also going to be critting on everything. And then for our rest of our gear, I went the route of, because I plan on be using this up to endgame, some defensive stuff. So I've got on here, you gain increased armor whenever you deal damage. This is going to be stacking up a percentage increase of our armor. We're going to be healing for every enemy that's close to us. So we've got two very like defensive aspects here to heal and give us armor. Then we've got damaging enemies with leap. Upheaval or Whirlwind has a 40 to 50% chance to summon an ancient. So this is going to give us more area coverage with our Whirlwind, because I didn't see anything to like increase the AoE of Whirlwind. So we're going to be using these ancients to spawn and then go spin with us. On this, I've got damage reduction for nearby bleeding enemies. I didn't find the you can stun bleeding enemies in this little build planner. So just here, it's like a filler spot for damage reduction, but I'd probably put the you can stun bleeding enemies here. And lastly, Whirlwind pulls enemies to you. This is going to just help us out with hitting big groups of enemies, because we'll be pulling them in. You don't want to put this on like a weapon slot or anything, because it doesn't have a percentage. And then lastly, this is going to be the stun aspect, giving us a big damage multiplier against stunned enemies. And then our rings we're going to be using for our resource regeneration, aka we restore primary resource whenever we crowd control an enemy, which is every single time we hit an enemy with Whirlwind. And then if a core skill hits 5 or more enemies, 20 to 40% of the resource cost is refunded. This is going to give us Whirlwind for free. This is a unique ring. Obviously, you could substitute this for like critical strikes with core skills, increase your attack speed until you get something like that. This is just going to be more damage for Whirlwind. But yeah, those are kind of the aspects I plan on rolling with. Now for the actual skill tree, we're going to be going Frenzy, mainly because it's a fast attacking skill that we can build up 2 of our aspects with. We're going to want to be building up our Fury as fast as possible, and this is going to give us a lot of Fury generation and increased attack speed, so it's a great pairing for Whirlwind. Next up, we're going Whirlwind, and I decided to go for the 30% increased damage until it's canceled, mainly because our bleeding is going to be scaling off of our percentage-based damage that we deal with Whirlwind, so the more Whirlwind damage we deal, the more bleed we deal, and that's why I'm not going the Whirlwind bleed. I'm probably going to mess around with this at endgame, but I think this is going to be the better choice. Next up, this skill I was mentioning, your core skills have up to a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Bleeding, stunning, critic, vulnerable, everything. It's going to be awesome. And vulnerable is just another damage multiplier on top of all our other damage multipliers. Next up, we've got Rallying Cry, movement speed, Fury generation, all those good things. Gives us unstoppable, so we can't be crowd controlled. And we generate Fury and get more resource regeneration when we use this shout. We're going to be using triple shout. Challenging shout is going to taunt enemies and give us damage reduction, increase our life, and whenever we get hit, we get 3 Fury back. In addition, we're going to be using War Cry. It's going to increase our damage, give us Berserking for 4 seconds, which is really nice, and gives us even more damage if there's nearby enemies. And once again, we will have nearby enemies because we're going to be pulling them in with Whirlwind. And also, lastly, our Shout skill effects duration are increased by 24%. This will give us more uptime. We're going to probably be looking for a cooldown on our gear so that we can have 100% uptime on Shout. That's going to kind of be like an end game goal. Next up, we get damage reduction while berserking, and while berserking, Fury generation is increased by 18%. We're going to be popping this before going into Whirlwind. Whirlwind's going to give us resource, and while we're Whirlwinding, we're going to get more resource back. Very, very nice. Next up, we deal increased damage to close enemies and get distant damage reduction, and 9% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. This is going to give us 9% against the slowed enemies, and with our Whirlwind aspect, we'll have 80% increased critical strike chance. So just this alone, I haven't actually done the calculations if this is additive with each other or multiplicative, but that would be 80% increased critical strike chance plus another 9%, which is looking very, very good. Bleed effects slow enemies by 10%, and your bleeding effects deal 18% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. The more bleed damage that we're going to be doing, the more bleed explosion that Skullbreaker aspect is going to be doing against enemies, giving us those nice, satisfying damage pops. Each time you take direct damage, you get base life as fortified. This is just in our survivability skill. I'm assuming Nightmare 4 and the harder contents are going to be pretty difficult, aka enemies are going to hit us like a truck, and so I did spec into some nice survivability skills as well to balance out all the damage we're going for. While using two-handed weapons, you deal 15% increased critical strike damage. we're going to be using those two-handed swords. We already have a bunch of critical strike chance, so this is another damage increase for our build. Increase our max fury by 9, heal for 9% of your maximum life for each 100 fury spent, which is going to be great because we'll get to our keystone in a second. And lastly, the last skill on our bar is going to be Wrath of the Berserker, explode into rage, knocking back surrounding enemies and gaining Berserker and Unstoppable. We've got now 2 sources of not being able to be crowd controlled, which is going to be very nice for late game. And then we get Berserking when we hit an enemy with a basic attack. Berserking is we're going to get increased movement speed, increased fury generation, and we're going to increase the Berserker damage bonus, which I think is 25% increased damage at base without any of these increases, which is really nice. And then lastly, we get to our keystone. Now, I personally went for Unbridled Rage. Core skills deal times 135% increased damage, but cost 100% more fury. I don't think this fury cost will do anything for this build because, once again, we're constantly refunding our fury whenever we're hitting enemies. We've got fury generation, and one of the base things of Whirlwind is you gain 1 fury each time Whirlwind deals direct damage to an enemy, or 4 fury against elite enemies. You're going to want to be grouping up enemies and spinning on top of them, and even in the beta, without many investments or anything, I was able to sustain Whirlwind, so I think we'll have no issues sustaining it at endgame, and that bleed is going to scale off of our direct damage, aka more bleed damage, because we're dealing more damage. I'll probably mess around with Gushing Wounds as well, because this will give us an actual bleed explosion every time we overpower an enemy. The only thing is, I haven't seen a super reliable way to overpower enemies or a legendary aspect or maybe a unique one. Maybe there is one late game that we'll be able to use to take more advantage of this. But until we find a very more consistent way of overpowering enemies, I'm probably going to be sticking with Unbridled Rage for that guaranteed ginormous damage increase. And that is going to be the build. I hope you guys enjoyed this build breakdown. Let me know if you plan on going Barbarian, what kind of build you plan on going. I freaking love the Whirlwind playstyle of being on the move, and I love damage over times, and this build is just looking too perfect for me, especially with all the different interactions and damage multipliers. I think Barbarian is going to be an endgame monster. I think it's obviously going to start out a little bit slower than some of the other classes, but I really do think that this character is going to be absolutely nuts at endgame, and I cannot wait for the full release. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will be updating this build once the actual game comes out, so if you enjoyed this build guide and plan on following it, I will also be making guides for this build when the actual game comes out and updating it to what actual gear is best and stuff like that, because obviously a lot of this is theory crafted, but love theory crafting. I'll catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.